Okay, before we go any further down this road on what separates me from Jason Jorjani on the issue of ethics, we've got to go down this rabbit hole of metaphysics even more, because I've got to make sure you're grasping this. What distinguishes me metaphysically from Jorjani, because there's so much that we have in common in terms of the mystical helomorphic view that I outlined in the first part of the series. So it might seem as though there's really no distinction and that this is all semantic. It will only become fully apparent as we get into the practicality of ethics. The practical application of the ethics. Only then will it be absolutely clear to you how all of this impacts ethics. But right for now, I need to lay this out a little bit more. So to recap very, very briefly, what I said in agreement with Jorjani is that there is a substance that has a super spectrum, and everything from abstract concepts and thoughts to concrete objects exists along that spectrum. So I'm sitting on this chair that keeps dropping down. Like I lift the lever, it raises me up, but then I slowly drop down. You're probably going to see me slowly drop down as this video continues. Everything exists along that spectrum. Jorjani, though, on the one hand, rejects any notion of a supreme being or divine intelligence or a god in any traditional sense. Whereas I don't. And I'll explain a little bit further along in this video why it is that he rejects a supreme God. And I'll explain why I don't think what he believes supports throwing out the concept of a supreme being. So let me tell you first, let me explain what I don't mean when I say that there are two aspects or two there are two aspects of God's being, or that there is differentiation within God. Because I don't want to be accused of the very dualism that I have spent so much time deconstructing and rejecting. So let me tell you what I don't think the Spirit of God is. God's nous or mind. I don't believe that God's spirit is nothingness. I don't believe that it is non-substantial. Like in the Christian world, you can't really get a solid answer about what the nature of God's spirit is, what the nature of spirit is. They give you the impression that it is really essentially nothing because it doesn't have substance at all. But then they want to argue that it has positive existence because it is God. It's not the nothing out of which God created the world. So somehow there's a difference. But in every other respect, when they keep going down the line and explaining what it isn't, it has no relation to anything that is manifest. I'm not saying that spirit is nothingness in the sense that a Christian would argue that spirit is a kind of nothingness. Okay, nor am I arguing that the Spirit of God is another substance in kind, another substance altogether from that substance, which enters into manifestation and produces all of the shapes and forms that we see that undergo change and evolution and so forth. So I'm rejecting both of those dualities. The Spirit of God exists along this very spectrum, superspectrum, that is occupied by abstract concepts and thoughts as well as concrete objects or material objects. But remember, I said that because it's one spectrum, even abstract concepts have a kind of materiality or sensuousness, a sensual nature. The Spirit of God, I would say, exists at the absolute highest point on the spectrum, such that it represents a permanence that cannot undergo the kind of corporeal manifestation or evolutionary change that the rest of him, i.e. his body, undergoes as the cosmos when it enters into manifestation and undergoes change and evolution and so on. So the Spirit of God not only represents the male or masculine aspect, pure awareness or awareness of awareness, metacognition, it represents that aspect of God which is permanent and undergoes no change whatsoever. Which is another reason I would reject the naturalistic view of Bernardo Kastrup. He believes all is consciousness, but he does not believe in he does not believe in an all-powerful entity. He believes that God is essentially nature undergoing change. So it's not that he would necessarily even call it God, but I'm just calling it God. So I'm saying there is a permanence to God that is represented by the nous or mind of God. And then his body does undergo change. That's what gets manifested corporeally as the world, as the cosmos, and undergoes change and evolution, etc. Now, when I say it's at the highest end of this spectrum, we can't think in terms of strict geometry or geography or topography. This is not a spectrum along which, if a finite creature like us just traversed long enough and far enough along this spectrum, we could potentially reach the permanence that is God. That's not possible. Okay. This comes back to a concept I've discussed before, and I'm going to bring it up again. In that I reject dualism, I realized that requires that I do away with the Platonic and Neoplatonic and Christian view of emanations and uncreated energies. Because the emanations of Plato, neither the emanations of Plato nor the uncreated energies of Christianity could literally bridge the two poles that are occupied by, on the one hand, the transcendent, ideal, eternal realm of Plato, or as, let's say, an Orthodox Christian would describe it, the world in the mind of God, with the physical world or the world of Plato's copies and shadows. The created and uncreated cannot be bridged by anything created or anything uncreated, because by nature they are infinitely apart, infinitely separate. So the only way you can have a non-dual reality is to think of it in terms of God dividing himself. Now, because God is infinite, he doesn't divide into literal parts the way an apple would divide into parts if you took a knife to it and divided it into 4 large slices. He is infinite. And so as a result, he can be infinitely divided without being in any way diminished or lessened. Okay? He doesn't get any smaller just because he divides himself and replicates himself over and over and over again into various forms, from animals and plants and minerals and humans to whatever else. Worlds. So what this means is that the creature, i.e. or e.g. you and me, could evolve everlastingly to the point where we are constantly adding new dimensions of experience to our lives, where we can occupy more and more dimensions than just the 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension of our world. as we continue evolving, we can add more and more dimensions to our experience, so that we're experiencing a greater number of dimensions, an ever greater number of dimensions simultaneously. And we can do that everlastingly, becoming more and more powerful, living longer and longer and longer, but never attaining to that absolute existence which belongs to God alone. So what connects the Spirit of God, which is absolute permanence, with the manifest, which doesn't have that same permanence? What connects them? Don't think in terms of a bridge that's connecting 2 points, 2 physical or geophysical or geographical points. It is God in his permanence acting to bring about the manifest. So it is God's action which, quote unquote, connects. It's his eternal activity. That node, think of it as a node or a knot, which is God's action in bringing things into manifestation. That node is what, quote unquote, connects God in his permanence to us as finite instantiations of impermanence. So we will never be able to traverse enough distance to reach that same permanence that only God occupies. And yet reality is still non-dual, not dual, because of the connection that we have eternally to the eternal action of God in manifesting us. But that action in manifesting us is not based on the pre-existence of an ideal form in God's mind of a human being. That would suggest that the forms exist before, quote unquote, the object that instantiates those forms or those transcendent ideas. God is not conditioned by time. And even for us, time doesn't really exist, but we experience something that we call time that God doesn't experience, but and so we give it a name, but it doesn't literally exist. Now, Jorjani believes that what I'm calling the eternal action of a personal God in bringing things into manifestation is not the activity of a personal God, but rather the activity of this flux, which I don't have a problem calling it the flux. This is something I have embraced. I think it's a very helpful idea, a very helpful explanation that Heraclitus brings out in stark relief, and it gives us a vivid picture of how to imagine how the eternal is constantly spinning out new shapes and forms. And of course, by forms, I'm talking about shapes. I'm not talking anymore about Plato's forms. which we reject. Um, but the principle of ontological unity, that which unites all seemingly disparate shapes and objects, and all polarities for Jorjani, is not a personal God, but rather just what he calls this dynamic tension that holds these pluralities and polarities together. So he's correct, and I think he's done better than most philosophers at preserving the oneness, the character of the oneness and manyness of reality. And he's correct in noting a dynamic tension that preserves distinction within polarity while not confusing them, but allowing them to remain distinct. And at the same time, it's that tension that prevents them from being separated so that there's still a union. He's correct in saying that. But I think that the dynamic tension, quote unquote, that he refers to is ultimately that eternal action of God that unites his the permanence of his spirit with the impermanence of his body. Now, when I say his body is impermanent, I don't mean that his body can disappear or his body can disintegrate and die. I mean that his body can undergo change. He can subject his body to change at will. His body can and does eternally manifest things. So what he's describing is a purely impersonal process. I'm describing as a personal process. So I don't have a problem talking about dynamic tension, the dynamic tension of polarity, or the flux, or anything. I don't have a problem using those terms. I would just say that there is something more fundamental underlying all of that. Because if this spectral substance that he lays out is only subject to change, what exactly is the principle of permanence underlying it? Okay, he would say it's the dynamic tension that keeps all these things in union. But how do you explain? Yes, that explains how you keep existing pluralities in a state of union. But he also talks in terms of how this flux is continually putting out new forms and bringing new things into existence. So how is that phenomena held together? What is it? What is the principle that underlying that? There's got to be something more than a shifting, moving, changing substance that is doing that. So you would have to bring in something more stable to underlie that very phenomena. And I have not been able to think of anything that can do that, save for a personal conception of an all-powerful God. Now, I would say that the change that God undergoes is totally voluntary. And he already exists in his spirit at that highest point on the spectrum. So the change that God chooses to experience when he manifests his body as different expressions of finitude is that he simply wants to experience it's not that she, we're not just talking about a masculine deity here. It's not simply that God is like an embryo or a fetus that is growing and learning the way a finite creature would grow and learn. He is already the highest principle that there is. He's the highest being that there is, that there could ever be. But at the same time, by manifesting worlds and manifesting this cosmos, he is undergoing an experience. He's undergoing experiences that he doesn't know or understand in his permanent aspect. Okay, so the paradox is that God must be capable of having experiences that are finite in order to truly be God. If there's anything God is incapable of doing, including experiencing reality in its finite, in a finite sense, then he wouldn't be God. All right, so I hope I didn't forget anything I wanted to say, because this is inching up to the 30-minute mark. But I think that's all I needed to say there. Hope you understood that. I really tried to slow down and try to unpack it very simply. I realize these are still very difficult things, but hopefully at least some of you got that. Thanks.